In 1907, a father and son vanished after Sunday service, leaving only silence behind. Decades later, their names appeared carved on a tomb no one had built. And that's when the real terror began. Thomas Hartwell had always been a meticulous man, the kind who organized his deceased grandmother's belongings with the same precision he applied to his accounting practice. The Victorian house on Elm Street had stood empty for 3 months since Eleanor Hartwell's passing, its rooms filled with the accumulated memories of 92 years. Thomas worked methodically through each room, sorting items into neat piles: donate, keep, discard. It was tedious work, but necessary. The estate needed to be settled before winter. The photograph fell from behind a warped frame containing his grandmother's wedding portrait, fluttering to the hardwood floor like a dried leaf. Thomas almost missed it entirely, catching only a glimpse of sepia tones as he moved toward the next box. When he bent to retrieve it, his breath caught in his throat. The image showed 2 figures standing before a small stone chapel. A man in his 30s wearing a dark suit and bowler hat, and a boy of perhaps 12 in knickers and suspenders. Both faced the camera with solemn expressions, their faces sharp and clear despite the photograph's obvious age. What unsettled Thomas wasn't the subjects themselves, but the chapel behind them. He recognized it immediately as Millbrook Chapel, the abandoned church that stood at the edge of town like a forgotten relic. Thomas had driven past it countless times on his way to visit his grandmother, noting its crumbling facade and overgrown cemetery. The chapel in the photograph, however, looked pristine, its stone walls clean, its windows intact, its bell tower proud against a cloudless sky. Thomas flipped the photograph over, finding spidery handwriting in faded brown ink. Father and son, Millbrook Chapel, October 13th, 1907. Below that, in different handwriting, someone had added, "They never came home." The words sent an inexplicable chill through Thomas's chest. He'd lived in this town his entire life, had heard the local legends and ghost stories that every small community cultivated. But this felt different. This felt real. He examined the photograph more closely under the desk lamp, noting details he'd initially missed. The man's face bore a striking resemblance to his own, the same angular jaw, the same deep-set eyes, the same slight furrow between the brows. The boy, too, shared familiar features, though his youth made the comparison less certain. Thomas felt a growing unease as he studied their expressions. Neither smiled, and their eyes held something he couldn't quite identify. Resignation, perhaps, or a knowledge of something terrible to come. The rational part of Thomas's mind supplied reasonable explanations. The photograph could be of distant relatives, some branch of the family tree his grandmother had never mentioned. The resemblance might be coincidental, or his imagination might be playing tricks after hours of sorting through dusty memories. But as he held the photograph, turning it over and over in his hands, another possibility began to take root, one that made his accountant's mind rebel, even as his instincts screamed its truth. Thomas spent the rest of the afternoon searching through his grandmother's papers, looking for any mention of the 2 figures, or any connection to Millbrook Chapel. He found birth certificates, marriage licenses, insurance policies, and decades of correspondence, but nothing that referenced the photograph or its subjects. His grandmother had been a meticulous record-keeper, saving every important document and many unimportant ones. Yet this photograph seemed to exist in a vacuum, unconnected to any other part of her carefully preserved history. As evening approached, Thomas found himself unable to concentrate on the remaining boxes. The photograph lay on the desk beside him, its subjects seeming to watch him with their solemn, knowing eyes. He'd grown up hearing stories about Millbrook Chapel, how it had been abandoned suddenly in 1907 after some unnamed tragedy, how the congregation had simply stopped coming one day and never returned. Local historians claimed the records had been lost in a fire, leaving only speculation about what had driven the faithful away from their sanctuary. The more Thomas stared at the photograph, the more convinced he became that it held answers to questions he was only beginning to understand. The date on the back, October 13th, 1907, coincided perfectly with the chapel's mysterious abandonment. The notation about the father and son never coming home suggested a disappearance, perhaps even the catalyst for whatever had befallen the chapel. And their faces, so familiar yet impossible, seemed to call to him across more than a century of silence. Thomas made a decision that would have seemed absurd to him that morning, but now felt inevitable. He would visit Millbrook Chapel, would see if the ruins held any trace of the truth the photograph seemed to promise. Perhaps he would find records, gravestones, some physical evidence of what had happened to the two figures captured in sepia tones. Or perhaps he would find nothing at all, and his accountant's mind could dismiss the whole mystery as coincidence and imagination. As he locked his grandmother's house and walked to his car, the October evening air carried the scent of dying leaves and distant wood smoke. The photograph was safely tucked in his jacket pocket, its weight seeming far greater than such a small thing should possess. Thomas started his engine and turned toward the edge of town, where Millbrook Chapel waited in the gathering darkness, like a keeper of secrets too terrible to speak aloud. "Tomorrow I'll have answers," he said to his reflection in the rearview mirror, not knowing how desperately he would come to regret those words. Dawn came gray and cold to Millbrook Chapel, its weak light struggling to penetrate the canopy of ancient oaks that surrounded the abandoned church. Thomas arrived early, parking his sedan on the narrow dirt road that led to the forgotten sanctuary. The building looked exactly as he remembered from his casual drives past. Weathered stone walls covered in ivy, windows dark as empty eye sockets. The bell tower listing slightly to one side, like a drunk trying to maintain his dignity. Yet as he approached on foot, photograph in hand, he noticed details that the distance had previously hidden. The chapel was smaller than he'd expected, perhaps capable of seating 50 people at most. Its architecture was simple but elegant, built in the Gothic Revival style popular in the early 1900s. What struck Thomas most was how well-preserved certain elements remained despite a century of neglect. The stone carving above the main entrance, depicting Christ welcoming children, was so crisp it might have been completed yesterday. The heavy oak doors, though weathered, still hung squarely on their hinges, without the sag he'd expected from such age. Thomas circled the building slowly, comparing its current state to the pristine chapel in the photograph. The perspective matched perfectly. This was undoubtedly the same structure, though time had worked its inevitable changes. He found the exact spot where the photographer must have stood, positioning himself to match the angle of the original image. When he held up the photograph, the alignment was perfect, creating an eerie overlay of past and present that made his skin crawl. The cemetery behind the chapel proved more unsettling than the building itself. Most of the headstones dated from the 1880s and 1890s, with a few reaching back to the 1870s. But Thomas noticed something odd as he walked among the weathered markers. There were no graves dated after 1907. It was as if death itself had abandoned Millbrook Chapel, along with its congregation, leaving only the silent stones of earlier generations to mark the passage of time. Thomas spent the morning documenting everything with his phone camera, taking hundreds of photos from every conceivable angle. He measured distances, noted architectural details, and created a rough sketch of the chapel's layout. His accountant's training in detail and documentation served him well, though he wasn't entirely certain what he was documenting or why. He only knew that the photograph in his pocket felt like a key, and he was determined to find the lock it opened. The breakthrough came when Thomas discovered a small maintenance shed hidden behind a cluster of evergreens at the cemetery's far edge. The structure was newer than the chapel, probably built in the 1920s or 1930s, and unlike the church itself, it showed clear signs of recent use. The padlock on its door was modern, and fresh tire tracks in the soft earth suggested regular visits by someone with access. Thomas's pulse quickened as he considered the implications. Someone was maintaining this abandoned place, someone who might have answers about the photograph and its subjects. Rather than attempt to break into the shed, Thomas decided to stake out the location. He returned home, gathered supplies for an extended surveillance, and was back at Millbrook Chapel before sunset. He positioned himself in his car at a distance that allowed clear observation while keeping him hidden among the trees. As darkness fell, Thomas settled in for what he expected to be a long, possibly fruitless vigil. His patience was rewarded at 11:47 p.m., when a battered pickup truck approached without headlights, navigating the dirt road by moonlight alone. Thomas watched as an elderly man emerged from the vehicle, moving with the careful precision of someone accustomed to working in darkness. The man, tall, thin, with wild white hair, unlocked the shed and disappeared inside. Moments later, a soft yellow glow indicated he'd lit a lantern or flashlight. Thomas waited 20 minutes before approaching, moving carefully through the trees to avoid detection. When he reached the shed, he could hear the man inside humming softly. A hymn, Thomas realized, though he couldn't identify the specific tune. He positioned himself near a small window and peered inside, his heart hammering as he prepared to confront whatever secrets the chapel guarded. The interior of the shed was a historian's dream and a skeptic's nightmare. The walls were covered with photographs, documents, maps, and newspaper clippings, all connected by red string, like a conspiracy theorist's web. The elderly man sat at a makeshift desk, working by lantern light on what appeared to be a hand-drawn timeline. When he turned slightly, Thomas caught sight of his profile and gasped. The man's features were unmistakably similar to those of the father in his photograph, aged by decades, but undeniably related. Thomas must have made some sound, because the man suddenly stiffened and turned toward the window. Their eyes met through the dusty glass, and Thomas saw no surprise in the old man's gaze, only a weary resignation, as if he'd been expecting this moment for years. The man stood slowly, walked to the shed door, and opened it wide. In the spill of lantern light, Thomas could see him clearly now. The same angular jaw, the same deep-set eyes, the same furrowed brow he'd studied in the photograph and seen in his own mirror. "Thomas Hartwell," the man said in a voice like autumn leaves, and it wasn't a question. "I've been waiting for you to find that photograph. My name is Samuel Blackwood, and I have a story to tell you about your family. A story that begins with two people who should have died in 1907, but didn't, and the terrible bargain they made to save this town from something far worse than death." Thomas felt the world tilt around him as Samuel's words sank in, the photograph in his pocket suddenly feeling like it was burning through the fabric. He looked into the old man's eyes and saw not madness as he'd hoped, but the unmistakable weight of truth, terrible, impossible truth that demanded to be heard. "The father and son in your photograph," Samuel continued, gesturing toward the shed's collection of evidence. They're your great-great-grandfather and his boy, and they're the reason you and everyone else in this town are still alive." Samuel Blackwood's shed was an archive of the impossible, a repository of evidence that chronicled events no rational mind could accept. As Thomas stepped inside, his eyes tried to process the hundreds of documents, photographs, and artifacts that covered every surface. Maps of the town from different decades showed subtle changes in geography. Roads that curved differently, buildings that appeared and disappeared, boundaries that shifted like living things. Photographs spanning more than a century depicted the same faces appearing at different times, aging slowly, or sometimes not at all, as if time moved differently for certain people in certain places. Samuel moved to a large chart on the far wall, his gnarled finger tracing lines that connected names, dates, and locations in a pattern that hurt Thomas's head to follow. "Your great-great-grandfather was Ezra Hartwell," Samuel began, his voice carrying the weight of a story told many times to an audience of empty air. The boy was his son, Marcus, 12 years old, and bright as a new penny. October 13th, 1907, was supposed to be just another Sunday service at Millbrook Chapel. But something had been building in this town for months. Something that fed on faith and twisted it into hunger. Thomas found himself drawn to a series of newspaper clippings dated from late 1907, their headlines growing progressively more disturbing. "Mysterious illness strikes Millbrook congregation. Local children report strange dreams. Town council calls emergency meeting on spiritual crisis." The articles described symptoms that modern medicine might classify as mass hysteria, shared nightmares, compulsive behaviors, people speaking in voices not their own. But the journalists of 1907 used different words: possession, corruption, divine punishment. "The thing that came to Millbrook Chapel wasn't evil in any way people understand," Samuel continued, pulling out a leather-bound journal filled with spidery handwriting. "It was hungry for the kind of pure faith that small communities like this one cultivated. It fed on belief, on the certainty that good people carried in their hearts, and when it was done feeding, it left behind something else, something that looked like faith but felt like emptiness, that sounded like prayers but tasted like ash." The journal belonged to Reverend Isaiah Blackwood, Samuel's great-grandfather and the chapel's last minister. Thomas read entries that chronicled the gradual transformation of the congregation over the summer and fall of 1907. Parishioners began arriving at services hours early, sitting in silent rows with their eyes closed and hands folded. Children stopped playing, standing motionless in the churchyard, like small sentinels. The hymns grew longer, more complex, incorporating melodies that no one remembered learning, but everyone somehow knew. By October, the congregation had become something else entirely, Samuel explained, his eyes distant with inherited memory. They still looked human, still spoke and moved and went about their daily lives, but they were empty vessels now, containers for something that wasn't quite thought and wasn't quite hunger, but was definitely growing stronger. Reverend Blackwood realized what was happening. But by then it was almost too late. The thing was ready to reproduce, to send seeds of itself to other towns, other churches, other communities, full of faithful people. Thomas studied a map, showing lines radiating out from Millbrook Chapel, like spokes on a wheel, each line ending at another town, another church, another potential feeding ground. Red X's marked the locations where the spread had been stopped, some by natural disasters, others by unexplained disappearances of entire congregations, and a few by what the journal euphemistically called divine intervention. The pattern suggested a coordinated effort to contain something that could have consumed the faith of thousands, leaving behind hollow shells that looked human, but served a different master entirely. "Your great-great-grandfather wasn't even particularly religious," Samuel said with a bitter laugh. "He came to church because his wife expected it, brought the boy because it was what good fathers did. But he had something the thing couldn't touch: doubt." Ezra Hartwell questioned everything, trusted nothing without proof, and approached faith with the same skepticism he applied to his business dealings. When Reverend Blackwood realized what was happening to his congregation, Ezra was the only person left who could still think clearly enough to help. The plan they'd developed was desperate and brilliant in its simplicity. The thing feeding on the congregation was anchored to the chapel itself, drawing power from the accumulated faith of decades of worship. It couldn't be destroyed. That had been tried and failed in other towns. But it could be contained if someone was willing to pay the price. 2 people, to be precise, bound to the chapel by an act of willing sacrifice, serving as guardians to ensure the thing never spread beyond Millbrook's borders. Thomas found photographs of the ritual itself, taken by Reverend Blackwood as evidence for future generations. Ezra and Marcus Hartwell stood before the chapel's altar, hands joined, their faces showing the same solemn resignation Thomas had noted in his grandmother's photograph. Ancient words were spoken, blood was spilled on consecrated ground, and 2 lives were bound to a place and purpose that would endure long after their mortal bodies should have crumbled to dust. "They didn't die that day," Samuel said quietly, watching Thomas's face as understanding dawned. "Death would have been a mercy. Instead, they became something between human and spirit, anchored to this place, tasked with containing something that grows stronger every year. They age, but slowly. They think and feel, and remember. But they're trapped here, unable to leave, unable to truly live, unable to find peace in death." The final piece of evidence was a series of photographs spanning more than a century, showing the same 2 figures at different times, in different seasons, always near the chapel: Ezra and Marcus Hartwell, father and son, guardians and prisoners, aging at perhaps 1/10 the normal rate, while time moved around them like water around stones. In the most recent photos, taken just months ago, they looked middle-aged and young respectively, their faces bearing the weight of decades of isolation and responsibility. Thomas stared at the evidence surrounding him, his rational mind finally surrendering to truths too vast and terrible to deny. The photograph in his pocket wasn't just a family memento. It was a key to understanding his own destiny, his own connection to events that had shaped his town for over a century. And somewhere in the darkness beyond the shed's walls, his great-great-grandfather and great-great-granduncle continued their eternal vigil, protecting a world that had forgotten they existed. "They're still here," Samuel said simply, confirming what Thomas had already begun to suspect. "Still guarding, still containing, still hoping that someday their sacrifice will be rewarded with the peace they've been denied for so long. But the thing they're guarding is growing stronger, and they're growing weaker, and soon they'll need help. Help that can only come from family, from blood, from someone willing to share their burden." Thomas looked up from the photographs to find Samuel watching him with eyes full of pity and ancient sorrow. And he realized with crystalline clarity that his discovery of the photograph hadn't been accidental at all. "How long have I got?" Thomas asked, surprised by the steadiness of his own voice. The meeting took place at midnight in the chapel sanctuary, where dust motes danced in shafts of moonlight, and the air itself seemed heavy with the weight of accumulated years. Thomas entered through the main doors, which opened at his touch despite having no visible means of operation, and found himself in a space that defied every expectation his earlier observations had created. The interior was pristine, untouched by time or weather, as if the century of abandonment existed only on the building's exterior. 2 figures waited in the front pew, their backs turned toward the entrance, and Thomas felt his breath catch as he recognized the precise positioning from his grandmother's photograph. They turned as he approached, and time seemed to fold in on itself. The faces he'd studied in sepia tones now regarded him with living eyes, aged but unmistakably the same. Ezra Hartwell looked perhaps 50 now instead of 30, his hair silver but his posture still strong. Marcus appeared to be in his 20s, no longer the 12-year-old boy from the photograph, but clearly the same person, transformed by decades of supernatural preservation. "Thomas," Ezra said, and his voice carried the weight of a century's worth of words unspoken. "You have our eyes. Eleanor's boy's boy, unless I'm mistaken. She used to bring you here when you were small, though you won't remember. We watched you grow from the shadows, watched you become the man we hoped you'd be." His smile was gentle, but infinitely sad, the expression of someone who had learned to find joy in small things while carrying an enormous burden. Marcus stood and extended his hand, a gesture both formal and desperate. When Thomas shook it, the young man's grip was firm but cold, his skin feeling almost translucent under Thomas's fingers. "We've been alone so long," Marcus said simply. "Father and I, we talk, but we run out of new things to say after the first few decades. We play games, tell stories, remember the world as it was, but it's not the same as having someone from outside, someone who chose to be here." Thomas took a seat in the pew across from them, the photograph now resting on the wooden surface between them like a bridge across time. "Samuel told me about the bargain, about what you're guarding," he said carefully. "But he didn't explain why I'm here, why I found the photograph now, after all these years." Even as he spoke, though, Thomas suspected he knew the answer, could feel it in the subtle wrongness of the air, in the way shadows seemed to move independently of their sources. Ezra's expression grew grave as he gestured toward the altar, where Thomas now noticed symbols carved into the stone that definitely hadn't been there in the daylight. "The containment is failing," he said bluntly. "Not through any fault of our own, but because the thing we're guarding has grown stronger, while we've grown weaker. It feeds on faith, and faith in small towns like ours isn't what it used to be. People believe in different things now, in smaller things, and their spiritual energy is scattered instead of concentrated." Marcus leaned forward, his young face etched with worry that belonged to someone far older. "We can feel it testing the boundaries, probing for weaknesses in the barriers we've maintained. Last month, the Henderson family started having the same dreams the congregation had in 1907. The week before that, Children began gathering in the churchyard, without remembering how they got there. The signs are subtle still, but they're growing stronger. Thomas found himself studying the altar more closely, noting how the carved symbols seemed to shift and writhe when he wasn't looking directly at them. "What exactly are you asking me to do?" he said, though part of him already knew the answer. The weight of destiny had been settling on his shoulders since the moment he'd found the photograph, growing heavier with each revelation, each piece of evidence Samuel had shown him. "The original bargain required two people," Ezra explained. "Father and son, bound by blood and choice, anchored to this place by love and sacrifice. But the magic, if that's what we're calling it, has evolved over the decades. It's learned from us, adapted to our presence, and now it needs more than two guardians to contain it. It needs a family, a bloodline, a connection that spans generations." The implications hit Thomas like a physical blow. They weren't asking him to replace them. They were asking him to join them, to become the third point of a triangle that could hold something vast and hungry in check for another century or more. His normal life, his accounting practice, his comfortable routines, all of it would end the moment he said yes. But if he said no, the thing they guarded would eventually break free, spreading to other communities, other families, creating an expanding circle of hollow-eyed faithful who served something that was definitely not divine. "Show me," Thomas said quietly. "Show me what we're really dealing with." Ezra and Marcus exchanged a look that spoke of decades of shared experience and mutual understanding. Together they stood and walked toward a door behind the altar that Thomas was certain hadn't existed moments before. The wood was black with age and carved with symbols that hurt to look at directly, and when Marcus turned the brass handle, the air in the sanctuary grew noticeably colder. The stairs beyond the door descended far deeper than the chapel's foundation should have allowed, spiraling down into darkness that seemed to have weight and texture. As they descended, Thomas became aware of a sound. Not quite music, not quite voices, but something that pulled at his mind with the promise of understanding things too vast for human comprehension. The walls were carved with the same shifting symbols he'd seen on the altar, but down here they glowed with a faint phosphorescence that provided just enough light to navigate. At the bottom of the stairs, they emerged into a circular chamber that existed in complete defiance of architectural possibility. The space was enormous, far larger than the chapel above, with a domed ceiling that stretched upward into absolute darkness. In the center of the chamber sat something that Thomas's mind refused to properly process. A writhing mass of shadow and hunger that simultaneously looked like nothing at all, and everything he'd ever feared in his darkest moments. "This is what came to Millbrook Chapel in 1907, Ezra said softly, his voice barely audible over the thing's continuous, not quite song. "It feeds on faith, on certainty, on the absolute belief that good people carry in their hearts. When it's done feeding, it leaves behind perfect servants, people who look and act human, but exist only to spread its influence to new communities, new sources of spiritual energy." Thomas stared at the contained horror, understanding now why his ancestors had accepted their terrible bargain. The thing pulsed with malevolent intelligence, testing the boundaries of the symbols that held it, searching constantly for weaknesses to exploit. If it ever broke free, it wouldn't just destroy Millbrook. It would spread like a virus, consuming the faith of thousands, leaving behind an army of hollow servants to help it find new feeding grounds. "The choice is yours," Marcus said, his hand resting gently on Thomas's shoulder. "We won't force this burden on you, won't use guilt or manipulation to make you stay. But if you walk away, we'll continue to weaken until we can't hold it anymore. And when that happens, everyone you've ever cared about will become something else. Something that looks like them, but serves a different master entirely." Thomas stood in the impossible chamber, surrounded by his supernatural ancestors and the thing they'd spent over a century containing, and felt the weight of choice settle around him like a shroud. His old life waited above, comfortable and predictable, and ultimately meaningless. Below, an ancient evil tested its bonds with patient intelligence, waiting for the moment when its guardians would finally fail. "If I stay," Thomas said finally, "will I still be me? Will I still be able to think, to feel, to remember who I was?" The questions felt childish even as he asked them, but he needed to know what he was sacrificing, what would remain of Thomas Hartwell after the bargain was struck. Ezra smiled, and in that expression, Thomas saw echoes of the man he'd been, the father who'd brought his son to church on a Sunday morning, never expecting to become something beyond human understanding. "You'll be yourself, but more," he said gently. "Bound to this place, yes, but also connected to something larger than any individual life. You'll have purpose, responsibility, and the knowledge that your sacrifice protects everyone you've ever loved." Thomas closed his eyes, thinking of his quiet life, his small apartment, his routine that had felt so important just days ago. Then he thought of his neighbors, his colleagues, the children he saw playing in the park near his office. All of them living their lives in blissful ignorance of the thing that wanted to consume their capacity for faith and leave them as empty shells serving an alien hunger. When he opened his eyes, Thomas found his ancestors watching him with expressions of hope and sorrow intermingled, understanding the weight of what they were asking, but knowing it was necessary. In the chamber's center, the contained horror pulsed with anticipation, perhaps sensing that the moment of decision had arrived. "I'll do it," Thomas said, and the words fell into the chamber's impossible acoustics like stones dropped into a deep well, echoing and re-echoing until they became something larger than speech, something that bound him to this place and these people for as long as his service was needed. The ritual began at dawn on October 13th, exactly 116 years after Ezra and Marcus Hartwell had first bound themselves to Millbrook Chapel. Thomas stood where his great-great-grandfather had stood, wearing the same dark suit he'd found carefully preserved in his grandmother's closet, the fabric somehow untouched by time and smelling faintly of lavender and old prayers. The morning light streamed through the chapel's windows in perfect golden shafts, illuminating dust motes that danced like tiny spirits, celebrating the completion of a circle that had taken more than a century to close. Samuel Blackwood served as witness and guide, his role inherited from Reverend Isaiah Blackwood, passed down through generations of caretakers who had maintained the secret and protected the knowledge necessary for this moment. He read from the same leather-bound journal his great-grandfather had used, the words flowing in languages that predated English, predated most human civilizations, carrying power that made the air itself seem to thicken and glow. Thomas felt the change beginning as the ancient words washed over him, a sensation like roots growing downward from his feet into the chapel's consecrated ground. The binding was gentler than he'd expected. Not the violent transformation of horror movies, but something that felt almost like coming home after a long journey. His consciousness expanded gradually, becoming aware of the chapel's every stone, every beam, every grain of dust in its shadowed corners. Thomas felt the change beginning as the ancient words washed over him, a sensation like roots growing downward from his feet into the chapel's consecrated ground. The binding was gentler than he'd expected, not the violent transformation of horror movies, but something that felt almost like coming home after a long journey. His consciousness expanded gradually, becoming aware of the chapel's every stone, every beam, every grain of dust in its shadowed corners. Ezra and Marcus stood on either side of him, their hands resting on his shoulders. And through their touch, Thomas could feel the network of connection that would now include him. A triangle of purpose that created something stronger than the sum of its parts. The thing in the chamber below thrashed against its bonds as the new configuration settled into place, its alien intelligence recognizing that its chances of escape had just diminished considerably. "You'll feel everything now," Ezra explained as the ritual reached its conclusion. "Every person who enters the chapel grounds, every shift in the spiritual energy of the town, every dream that carries too much weight or prayer that tastes like hunger instead of hope. It's overwhelming at first, but you'll learn to filter it, to focus on what matters, while letting the rest flow around you like background music." Thomas nodded, already sensing the truth of his ancestors' words. He could feel the Hendersons in their house 3 miles away, their dreams carrying echoes of the same corruption that had claimed the congregation in 1907. He could sense children in the schoolyard, their games taking on patterns that mimicked the symbols carved into the chapel's hidden chambers. Most disturbing of all, he could feel other places like Millbrook Chapel, scattered across the continent. Points of darkness, where similar battles were being fought by other guardians, other families who had made the same terrible choice. The binding complete, Thomas found himself seeing the world with new eyes that could perceive layers of reality previously invisible to him. The chapel existed simultaneously in multiple dimensions, its physical form just one aspect of something far more complex. The town of Millbrook spread out around them like a web, with the chapel at its center, and Thomas could trace the lines of spiritual energy that flowed through streets and homes, like invisible rivers of light and shadow. Samuel closed the journal and stepped back, his role in the ceremony complete. "The knowledge will come to you gradually," he said, his voice carrying the weight of a burden finally shared. "Dreams, mostly, carrying memories and understanding from those who came before. You'll learn the signs to watch for, the methods of containment, the ways to strengthen the barriers without causing suspicion among the townspeople." Over the following weeks, Thomas discovered that his new existence was both more and less than he'd anticipated. His physical needs were greatly diminished. He required little sleep, less food, and could go days without rest when necessary. His senses had expanded beyond the normal human range, allowing him to perceive spiritual energies and detect supernatural intrusions that would have been invisible before. Most remarkably, he found that he could still leave the chapel grounds for brief periods, though he was always drawn back, like a compass needle pointing toward magnetic north. His accounting practice continued, though his clients began to notice subtle changes in his demeanor. A new depth to his eyes, a tendency to pause mid-conversation, as if listening to something they couldn't hear, an uncanny ability to sense when people were hiding important information. Thomas discovered that his expanded awareness made him remarkably good at detecting financial fraud and emotional deception, skills that served his business well, while allowing him to maintain the facade of normalcy his new role required. The first real test came 6 weeks after the binding, when the Henderson family's corruption reached critical mass. Thomas felt it building like pressure in his skull, a wrongness that grew stronger each night until he could no longer ignore it. Working with Ezra and Marcus, he learned to project his consciousness beyond the chapel grounds, to touch the minds of the affected family members and gently guide their dreams away from the patterns that threatened to make them servants of the contained horror. It was delicate work, requiring a combination of supernatural ability and very human empathy. Thomas had to understand each family member's fears and desires, their spiritual vulnerabilities and emotional strengths, crafting individual interventions that felt natural while serving the larger purpose of protection. When Rebecca Henderson began sleepwalking toward the chapel at midnight, Thomas was there to gently wake her and guide her home, implanting suggestions that would make her avoid the area in future. When young Tim, Ezra, and Marcos stood on either side of him, their hands resting on his shoulders, and through their touch, Thomas could feel the network of connection that would now include him, a triangle of purpose that created something stronger than the sum of its parts. The thing in the chamber below thrashed against its bonds as the new configuration settled into place, its alien intelligence recognizing that its chances of escape had just diminished considerably. "You'll feel everything now," Ezra explained as the ritual reached its conclusion. "Every person who enters the chapel grounds, every shift in the spiritual energy of the town, every dream that carries too much weight or prayer that tastes like hunger instead of hope. It's overwhelming at first, but you'll learn to filter it, to focus on what matters, while letting the rest flow around you like background music." Thomas nodded, already sensing the truth of his ancestors' words. He could feel the Hendersons in their house 3 miles away, their dreams carrying echoes of the same corruption that had claimed the congregation in 1907. He could sense children in the schoolyard, their games taking on patterns that mimicked the symbols carved into the chapel's hidden chambers. Most disturbing of all, he could feel other places like Millbrook Chapel scattered across the continent, points of darkness where similar battles were being fought by other guardians, other families who had made the same terrible choice. The binding complete, Thomas found himself seeing the world with new eyes that could perceive layers of reality previously invisible to him. The chapel existed simultaneously in multiple dimensions, its physical form just one aspect of something far more complex. The town of Millbrook spread out around them like a web, with the chapel at its center, and Thomas could trace the lines of spiritual energy that flowed through streets and homes, like invisible rivers of light and shadow. Samuel closed the journal and stepped back, his role in the ceremony complete. "The knowledge will come to you gradually," he said, his voice carrying the weight of a burden finally shared. "Dreams, mostly, carrying memories and understanding from those who came before. You'll learn the signs to watch for, the methods of containment, the ways to strengthen the barriers without causing suspicion among the townspeople." Over the following weeks, Thomas discovered that his new existence was both more and less than he'd anticipated. His physical needs were greatly diminished. He required little sleep, less food, and could go days without rest when necessary. His senses had expanded beyond the normal human range, allowing him to perceive spiritual energies and detect supernatural intrusions that would have been invisible before. Most remarkably, he found that he could still leave the chapel grounds for brief periods, though he was always drawn back like a compass needle pointing toward magnetic north. His accounting practice continued, though his clients began to notice subtle changes in his demeanor, a new depth to his eyes, a tendency to pause mid-conversation, as if listening to something they couldn't hear, an uncanny ability to sense when people were hiding important information. Thomas discovered that his expanded awareness made him remarkably good at detecting financial fraud and emotional deception, skills that served his business well, while allowing him to maintain the facade of normalcy his new role required. The first real test came 6 weeks after the binding, when the Henderson family's corruption reached critical mass. Thomas felt it building like pressure in his skull, a wrongness that grew stronger each night until he could no longer ignore it. Working with Ezra and Marcus, he learned to project his consciousness beyond the chapel grounds, to touch the minds of the affected family members, and gently guide their dreams away from the patterns that threatened to make them servants of the contained horror. It was delicate work, requiring a combination of supernatural ability and very human empathy. Thomas had to understand each family member's fears and desires, their spiritual vulnerabilities and emotional strengths, crafting individual interventions that felt natural while serving the larger purpose of protection. When Rebecca Henderson began sleepwalking toward the chapel at midnight, Thomas was there to gently wake her and guide her home, implanting suggestions that would make her avoid the area in future. When young Timothy Henderson started drawing the same symbols Thomas had seen carved in the chamber below, careful manipulation ensured the boy's teacher would redirect his artistic interests toward more benign subjects.